Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for a look at the early engagements of the Falkland Islands War. So far in this series, we've covered the road to war, and that's the events leading up to the war with historical context, the Argentinian invasion and seizure of Port Stanley, and most recently, an overview of British Task Force logistics and their build-up to respond. So in keeping with the chronology, today's discussion will cover that early period just after the British Task Force main body arrival to the Falklands, which would have been late April into early May, ahead of any amphibious landings by British commandos, which that was later into the month of May, 1982. Remember, it took 3 weeks for the task force to arrive to the region from Portsmouth Harbor in the UK. This discussion will focus on events surrounding the Falkland Islands proper, not any of the early activity over on South Georgia, because there was a lot of activity, a whole slew of activity that dates well back into early to mid-March of 1982. We won't get into any of that today. I touched on some of the early activity in South Georgia during the Road to Crisis, so let's get started. So we'll start with an important part of the early days of the war when Britain made the declaration that a maritime exclusion zone, or MES, would be effective on April 28 and enforced on April 30th, 1982 around the islands, which encompassed 200 miles around the islands. Let's turn this on here. So if we pan out, we can see this is approximate, of course, but this is about 200 miles around the islands. This MES prohibited the entry of any Argentine naval vessels or military enabling ships, which had become somewhat controversial due to the fact that commercial vessels and fishing vessels were routinely operating, Argentine vessels were routinely operating and working in these waters. So my question is, who gets to make the call as to whether a vessel is an enabler, a military enabler or not? There were no regulating authorities to reconcile or clarify declarations. So also, who is reconciling activity that occurs outside of the boundary, which was an issue, as we'll discuss here in a minute. A couple days later, on April 30, 1982, the main task force arrived to the MES, and so I turned that on. So you can see right on here, this is also approximate. This is just things that I've looked and I've read in publications, and I've just kind of recreated here on Google Earth. Then on May 1st, 1982, one of the first engagements of the war took place as a British Vulcan bomber executed a bombing run of the Port Stanley airfield with 21 1,000-pound bombs. This did not render the airfield inoperable, but it did demonstrate that this medium to short-range Vulcan bomber could reach out and touch Argentine forces if need be. So this was a symbolic bombing run. It was a symbolic victory for the British, despite the fact that it did little to affect Argentine flight operations. It showed that this medium-range bomber had a lot more capability with refueling than previously thought. 24 hours later, on May 2nd, 1982, the first major engagement of the war took place as the British submarine, the HMS Conqueror, sank the Argentine cruiser, the ARA General Belgrano. The Conqueror launched 3 Class 8 torpedoes at the Belgrano, of which 2 hit and sank the Belgrano. 323 Argentine sailors lost their lives, and the harsh reality of war had now been realized. Controversy swept the world stage as the Belgrano had been sunk, as you can see here, some 40 miles southwest of the TES, or by this time the Maritime Exclusion Zone had now been turned into a total exclusion zone. But British intel claimed that the Belgrano was part of an Argentine task force that was being organized to engage the British task force. It turns out that British intel was correct. In a 2003 interview with the former captain of the Belgrano, Hector Bonzo, he accepted that the attack was legitimate since the Belgrano had been given orders to seek out and destroy all British ships. But as you can see here, it was certainly placed outside of the total exclusion zone. Then on May 3rd and May 4th, a second Vulcan bombing run was conducted on the Stanley Airport. These bombing runs conducted by the Vulcan Squadron were part of Operation Black Buck. These were flown from Ascension Island, some 6,100 kilometers away from Stanley, which was an impressive operation considering these were short to mid-range bombers. These bombers were built for NATO operations across Northern Europe, not for long-range bombing missions. So they were not built for these extremely long-range 6,100-kilometer missions that they were conducting from Ascension. But some brilliant planning by the RAF and expertly conducted refueling operations made these Vulcans very capable platforms. On the second bombing run, the XM-607 performed a low-level approach with a last-minute ascent to 4,900 meters to avoid SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, and likely caused it to miss the runway, so it hit in this area right here. But it did cause enough damage to the western end of the airport that the Argentines were unable to extend the runway for high-performance combat aircraft. It was relegated to C-130s and support aircraft for the duration of the war. So in a way, Black Buck 2 was partially successful. Now on May 4th, the tables turn as Argentinian forces strike back up along the northeastern boundary of the TES, as you can see here. The HMS Sheffield, a British Type 42 guided missile destroyer, was conducting a patrol along the northeastern boundary of the TES when two well-trained Argentinian pilots flying French Super Etendard multi-role jet aircraft launched two AIM-39 Exocet anti-ship missiles at the HMS Sheffield. So these Argentinian pilots, they knew to approach at a low altitude and executed perfectly at 30 meters above the water, which is like 95 feet. The Sheffield's, unfortunately, the Sheffield's Type 965 radar was pretty dated and did not detect the approaching Super Etendards at their low altitude. They were detected by the HMS Glasgow and I believe the Invincible. They had more advanced systems. One of the Exocets missed the Sheffield, the other hit starboard at deck 2. The Sheffield took on a lot of damage. It didn't sink immediately. It sunk 6 days later on May 10th, and 20 British crewmen lost their lives as a result. A board of inquiry held later revealed gaps in technology, crew training, and slow responses as warnings had been received, in one instance as much as 19 minutes prior. So it would be interesting to kind of look at this board of inquiry a little bit more. But one of the things that did come out of this is point defense systems would become standard on all smaller vessels after this incident. That was a major gap in technology and defensive capability that was identified as a result of this incident. Finally, one of the last early engagements of this war was a raid conducted by British Special Forces on a small island known as Pebble Island on the West Falkland Island chain. So let's take a look. So it's way over here on the West Falkland. I found an airfield. Let's turn it on. So we kind of zoom in. I just looked around on the island and I found this. This looks like the remnants of the airfield, and I'm almost positive that's it. Although I can't find it on a map, just a general description of the airfield's location. But the SAS conducted a night infiltration of this small Argentine airfield that was being used to stage close air support aircraft such as the FMA IA-58 Pucara. The SAS team consisted of approximately 45 operators that air assaulted to the island from two Sea King helicopters. Once they infiltrated the airstrip, they were able to move freely to the flight line undetected, where they laid charges and severely damaged 7 Pucaras. The SAS was then able to begin their exfil before any major Argentine defenses were alerted. Once back on the HMS Hermes, the HMS Broadsword opened fire on the runway with its 4.5-inch guns, causing further damage. I think that this has been a fair assessment of early engagements during the Falkland Islands War. There were, of course, other engagements not covered, such as follow-on Black Buck missions. There were smaller Harrier sorties. One Harrier was shot down over Goose Green, I believe, on May 4th. And then there were smaller SAS missions over on the East Falklands. Also during all this time, don't forget the Commando Task Force, the majority of the task force is still on its way and has now passed Ascension as of mid-May. So they're on their last leg of transit. And additionally, so back in Britain, the ground task force is growing, and the Queen Elizabeth II has now been dispatched with an additional ground force element from the 5th Infantry Brigade, so another couple thousand ground troops. So you start to see the ground force, the commando, not just the commando brigade, but the larger joint task force start to really take shape. So ground operations are about to begin, And all these shaping operations that happened during the early engagement period really set the stage for the amphibious landings at San Carlos. And finally, by May 22nd, here, just to kind of keep us on the chronology, all of the 3rd Commander Brigade is now ashore, and the brigade maintenance area has been established. So I think we'll finally cover the amphibious landings and early ground campaign in the next installment. So thanks for watching today. Don't hesitate to leave a comment if I missed something or if you spot an inaccuracy somewhere. Thanks again.